we're ready for our next presentation, which is on how Saudi Arabia's reforms mask political oppression. And we're very fortunate to have Sarah Aziza here. She splits her time between New York City and the Middle East, and she's lived and worked in Saudi Arabia, Jordan, the West Bank, and South Africa. As a journalist, she focuses on human rights, refugees, women, and the Middle East, seeking to elevate the human complexity behind global issues. Her work has been featured in Harper's Magazine, The Washington Post, The New Yorker.com, The Atlantic, The Intercept, The Nation, Slate, and the Middle East Eye. That's wonderful. As well as the National Public Radio. She's currently working on a book based on her reporting on women's stories in the Middle East. So join me in welcoming Sarah Aziza.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you. I'm glad to hear everyone's still awake. Thank you, the Pulitzer Center. Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Hannah and Fareed and everyone else for being here and for making this gathering possible. It's been really exciting to hear all the circulating thoughts in the room so far, and I imagine there's going to be a lot more really fruitful exchange in the next day and a half. So I just commend you all for being here, and I commend all of your work. I have a lot of teachers and educators who mean a lot to me in my life, and truly one of the most noble professions, in my opinion. All right, so I'm going to present a little bit about a few stories I've worked on in conjunction with the Pulitzer Center, and then I'm looking forward to our conversation afterwards. So I'll be speaking to you today about a few of the stories that I've reported out of Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is a topic that's been in the news a little bit more than usual lately, but it's largely, in my opinion, been a nation that's been sort of flattened, reduced to a few things. In the past, a lot of times, if you ask someone what they knew about Saudi Arabia, it would their answer would probably be based on their knowledge of the oil reserves and the massive amounts of oil exported from Saudi Arabia, or post-2001, some sort of association with terrorism. Probably, if someone's really well-read, they'll probably mention that women can't even drive there. So a bit about the country itself. So it was founded in 1932. The population is roughly 30 million, but it's the 12th largest by area in the world. So it's a very large country. As you can see, it takes up the vast majority of the Arabian Peninsula. I included this map, which can also kind of remind you the neighborhood where Saudi Arabia exists. So I'm excited to hear this afternoon. We're going to hear from a colleague who reports in Yemen. You've probably heard a lot about Yemen in the news in the past few months and years. We're also hearing a lot about Iran lately, so you can see how close Iran and Saudi Arabia are, as well as Iraq. So you can just understand sort of like the regional importance. And that's without mentioning that Saudi Arabia is the site of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam. So there's a lot of gravity that Saudi Arabia sort of occupies in the ideology and the imaginations and the culture of millions and millions of people across the globe, 1 billion plus, just when you think about the number of Muslims in the world, not to mention all the other reasons why Saudi Arabia really does have a large impact on the world. Yeah, and you can see the note right at the bottom about the Shia population. Roughly 10 to 15% of the population is Shia, and that's again a word that you might be hearing buzzing in the news right now as we're waiting to see what will arise between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and just that general Sunni-Shia divide that is largely a recent construct, but is one that's been used a lot in the news by our Western media as well as by certain political actors in the region as well. So a bit about, just making connections to our lives here in the United States, and in many of our cases as American citizens. So the US and Saudi Arabia has had a long-standing partnership The relationship began in the 1930s when Saudi Arabia granted the first concessions to an American oil company. And from there, the illustrious relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia began. So it has roughly 18% of the world's known oil reserves, and until very, very recently was the largest producer of oil. That does anyone know what the nation with the largest producer of oil is now? USA, yeah. But the Saudi Arabia still exports more. So as you can imagine, especially in the past, in the 1970s, through recent history, that was an incredibly powerful position to hold in the world when oil was such a dominant driver in the energy economy and technology, and then by extension politics and military and strategic interests. There's been a lot more, maybe since the 90s, emphasis between the US and Saudi Arabia as far as strategic interests, whether it's the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or especially post 9/11. US presidents have often emphasized the need to maintain strong ties to Saudi Arabia as a partner in combating extremism. It's a complex relationship. 15 of the 19 hijackers of 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia, the Saudi ruling family, was also greatly threatened by bin Laden and al-Qaeda. I was actually living in Saudi Arabia at the time, and yeah, it was a very terrifying time for the Saudi royal government because that was one of al-Qaeda's main objectives. They saw the Saudi government as corrupt and wanted to overthrow them. So as you can see, some of our past presidents have made a point to get their photo ops and visits and goodwill visits and interactions with Saudi rulers. So that's Salman and Abdullah with Bush and Obama, respectively. So things have really accelerated under Trump. Again, if you may have heard some of this in the news, but Trump, when he was still on the campaign trail, was praising the Saudis, but also emphasizing how great they were going to be for U.S. business interests. So he promised to strengthen those ties, largely through increasing U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And this is problematic in many ways, including the fact that many reports have shown that U.S.-made weapons have been perpetrators or have been instruments of potential war crimes and contributed to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. So there's a lot of ethical issues that arise, but Trump has really made a point of wanting to emphasize and increase arms sales and exports to Saudi Arabia. He's promised a $450 billion deal, which actually is so far been a misrepresentation of what's actually transpired. But yeah, you can see he made the first stop overseas as president to Saudi Arabia and famously danced with Saudi sheikhs holding swords, and this famous picture, people accusing him of bowing to Saudi Arabia. He's getting a royal award, the highest award, presented by the Saudi king, was presented to him upon arrival. So it's really been a relationship that the Saudis have reciprocated. And of course, as many of you are probably aware, there's a lot of problems that arise by cozying up to a nation like Saudi Arabia. It's consistently ranked on the bottom of any way you want to slice it, whether it's women's rights, immigrants' rights, LGBTQ, environmental. Any way you look at it, Saudi Arabia has not been a great actor on any of these fronts, and it's also been a reliable exporter of some extremist Islamic teachings that have been directly linked to many acts of terror. So, yeah, as well as leading the coalition forces that have contributed to such a dire humanitarian crisis in Yemen. So there's a lot of different angles with which to look at what we might be contributing to as a nation as we continue to sell and equip the Saudis with these technologies. Okay, moving in more currently into the present and into my own project. So how many of you have heard the name Mohammed bin Salman? Yeah, that's pretty good. I was actually with the Pulitzer Center in a outreach event at a high school a few months ago, and actually many of the high schoolers themselves had heard of Mohammed bin Salman. But there was a lot of buzz around this prince beginning in 2016. He was around 30 at the time, and suddenly this younger son of the king of Saudi Arabia started to appear in more and more media. Traditionally, the Saudi royal family is very quiet. They stay away from the media and press, and they tend to speak through third parties in very stilted royal announcements that just get posted online. But this was a young prince that wanted to be in front of the camera, wanted to speak, wanted to court the Western press in particular, and really, really succeeded at first. So you have a few clips right there of major American news outlets that were publishing profiles on this prince, speculating very famously with the reporters such as myself who focus on this issue or the region love to pick on that one on the far bottom right. Thomas Friedman famously wrote a glowing review of the Crown Prince, really touting the prince as a true reformer, someone who was going to remake the Middle East and thus or remake Saudi Arabia and thus turn the entire Middle East towards moderate Islam, and how the Arab Spring had come at last. This was before many of the recent scandals, which we'll get to. So yes, this was a young Saudi prince who was pivoting his way up the hierarchy, and now is the crown prince, having to sort of jump the line and get ahead of many of the other princes who were ahead of him in line. He is now the next in line for the Saudi throne at 33, which is an unprecedented thing to consider. But yes, he was widely praised, widely lauded. People were very excited about him 2016, 2017. And very famously in 2017, he announced that he was going to end the ban on women drivers, which was like the symbol for so many years of Saudi Arabia's backwardness. And along with ending the ban on women drivers, he was going to open the first movie theater in the country and started inviting musicians to perform and touting this new Saudi Arabia as one that was going to be culturally relevant, modern, and this was all really in pursuit of Western investment. He felt that it was time to modernize the Saudi economy away from oil. And for a long time, through the help of many very famous U.S. and Western consulting firms, he was able to really craft this image. He would go on media tours and really charm a lot of people in the West. So this is where I come in, I guess you could say. My interest in Saudi Arabia does stem many years back. I first moved to Saudi Arabia as a young girl in the 90s. I'm of Arab descent, and I have a strong interest in the region. I've spent roughly half my life living in Saudi Arabia as well as other Arab countries. And I am an American citizen as well, so I sort of straddle those two worlds, and I feel a responsibility to both. So in 2016, 2017, I was living in New York. I was working as a journalist, mostly covering the Syrian refugee crisis, but began to notice all of a sudden a lot more stories in the press about Saudi Arabia. And like I mentioned before, all my life I'd been used to kind of rolling my eyes when I saw Saudi Arabia come up in the news, because I knew it was probably just going to be some sort of financial headline about crude oil production, or is going to be a very tired, redundant story about how women can't drive, or how backwards Muslims are, or sort of those really reductive, shallow stories that tended to come out about Saudi Arabia. There was not a lot of like real critical analysis, but this was something new with MBS, as they call him, Mohammed bin Salman. The stories started to, there was just a lot more attention and buzz around Saudi Arabia. However, I was following the issue fairly closely, but it was no secret that at the same time that this crown prince was opening movie theaters and even allowing women the right to drive, he was quietly locking up dozens and dozens of peaceful activists. The women who had worked in some of their cases for 30 or 40 years trying to peacefully advocate for more equality for women, for more gender empowerment, or for more civil and human rights in general. Saudi Arabia has no political parties, no elections truly to speak of, apart from very meaningless municipal elections. But there's no such thing as like political representation. Media is heavily censored. Civil discourse is heavily discouraged. So there have always been a small, brave, and very embattled contingent of peaceful activists in the country who have struggled for years for their rights. And many of them, including some of the women pictured here, had been jailed in the past for advocating for the right to drive or better equality for women, but after being punished by the government, had kind of retreated from activism and had been silent for many years. But suddenly this crown prince was seeking them out and locking them up. And this was a very disturbing pattern that I noticed, and noticed that there was still very little coverage of. And I was critical of just sort of like the one-sided coverage that I was seeing. So I applied for a Pulitzer grant to travel back to Saudi Arabia in time to watch the ban on women drivers being lifted. And I will acknowledge it was a very paradoxical time. I have many dear friends who are Saudi women, and it was truly exciting for them to finally get behind the wheel. At the time, they were the only women in the world who did not have the right to drive. Even the most famous nations people love to point to as oppressors of women, i.e. Iran, Afghanistan, women can drive there. You know, we've got many examples of women in leadership in many of these countries, but Saudi Arabia was still far, far behind. So it was a step forward for women, although arguably symbolic. But it was an exciting time, and if you can see here, this is a picture I took on that night. I was with some Saudi women. This is one woman whose name I won't mention, but she was an activist, a member of a prominent family and an activist for many years, who had long called for the right to drive. And in the back seat are a few of her friends, and actually in the front seat you can't really see her, but her granddaughter was there. So it was a very beautiful night to go to their home, and they were dancing and singing and clapping, and at midnight they all got in their cars and they paraded around the Corniche in Jeddah along the sea. So it was a really exciting time, and they truly felt empowered and excited. And at the time they were literally singing the praises of Mohammed bin Salman. But at the same time, I was interviewing journalists and other Saudis who were describing to me a very different reality. Many of them were connected to the people who were in jail, these people who we later found out were subject to torture, sexual assault. We spoke on my reporting trip about how many more people were deleting their Twitter accounts, which Twitter was the main way that people organized in Saudi Arabia, especially women, because they had very limited freedom of movement and they felt a lot safer online. But many people were retreating even from Twitter activism. They were going silent, even in private circles, afraid to speak about anything vaguely political. It had never been acceptable to openly criticize the Saudi royal family, but now people had the sense that you don't know what might trigger an arrest, or in many cases there are Saudis who are under travel bans or who have had family threatened or who have lost their job simply for being academics or intellectuals or being someone that the Crown Prince thinks might in the future be critical. And this extends to liberals and conservatives. The Prince has also locked up many conservative religious leaders. It sort of seems like he's trying to constantly narrow the narrative as he's consolidating more and more power in his own hands. He's wanting to shut out anyone who might have something to say or might want to contribute to the narrative. And in one case, I'll just go back one slide. So the woman on the left in this series of 3 photos, her name is Loujain Al-Hathloul. Has many of you heard of her? You'll be able to find a lot on her if you're curious, but she's sort of was the face beginning about 15 years ago of the push for the women's right to drive. She famously took to the streets, took the wheel and drove, broadcasting herself as she did so. As a peaceful campaigner for women's rights, she was arrested, jailed, detained for a long time, then released, and actually, in one of my stories that I did for the Pulitzer, my first Pulitzer grant, I describe how she received a call a few months before the Crown Prince made his announcement that he was going to lift the driving ban. And it was the royal court saying, we're going to give the right to drive to women, and don't you dare say a word about it, not even a positive word. And she... this happened to many, many other activists too. So even people who would potentially be praising the Saudi Crown Prince were warned to be silent. Lujain actually did end up tweeting that night when the announcement went out. All she tweeted was, "Thank God." And she got a text from the royal court saying, "Why are you not obeying your orders? We told you to stay silent." A few days later, she was arrested. She's still in jail. So yes, the atmosphere on the ground was quite conflicting. In summary, I will just say this anecdote that one Saudi journalist shared with me, which is, yes, under the Crown Prince, they're opening Starbucks, and you can see men and women mixing together in Starbucks. And they're very excited that they're able to go to Starbucks together and maybe mingle a little bit. But they're not able to speak their mind. When they meet in the Starbucks, everybody's censoring themselves, glancing over their shoulder, and keeping themselves to completely innocuous topics. So it was this dual experience of going to a movie theater or going to a Starbucks and feeling in some ways that this was suddenly a different Saudi. But at the same time, in many ways, things were regressing. People were afraid to even talk about social issues. Interestingly, Saudi Arabia was also at the time issuing more and more cybersecurity laws and fake news laws, saying that the sharing of any fake news online was a punishable offense, and they defined fake news as anything that would defame the nation, the royal family, or the religion of Islam, which is very broad and was enough to spook enough people to not want to talk even about social issues online or in person. So anyway, for my first reporting trip, I really came away very convinced that my hunch was right, that there were two stories happening at the same time, and that the uncomplicated story in the media back here, which if you remember these stories, Saudi Arabia's Arab Spring at last, it was not complicated enough. It was not acknowledging the very grave trends that were also going on in plain sight, but just below the surface. Just would have required a little more digging and a little more willingness to be critical of this Crown Prince, rather than sort of, I don't know, endorsing his version of the story too quickly. So that was basically the gist of the coverage that I did. And as you can see in the center story, I wrote that the day of the ending of the driving ban, and I tried to speak to the complexities, that there are some women who genuinely do feel like their lives are advancing, and there are also reasons why other people feel less safe, less empowered, and more frightened than ever before. So the timing of my coverage ended up being very interesting. My larger report, the one on the far left, Kingdom Crackdown, that was a 5,000+ word report that came out of my first Pulitzer grant, and it took some time editing and writing, and by the time we finally hit publish, it was the first week of October 2018. And that date is significant because that is the same week that this man, who many of you may have heard of, Jamal Khashoggi, went into the Saudi consulate in Turkey and was never heard from again. My editor actually called me right as we were going to hit publish on the story and said that, things like he had just heard a buzz that this prominent Saudi journalist had disappeared, and did I know anything about it, and what did I think was going on? And I was in total shock. Actually, in my story, I interviewed Jamal Khashoggi for my story for the Pulitzer Center, and I was shocked to hear that he had decided to go into the consulate. He had told me himself that he would never set foot in the Saudi embassy. So I was shocked that he had taken that risk. I'm guessing many of you have heard this story. How many of you have heard of Jamal Khashoggi? Yeah, so okay, I don't need to describe, in too much detail, but as you all know, he disappeared into the Saudi embassy. He never emerged. Investigations later have revealed more and more, and there last week, or maybe 10 days ago now, the UN came out with another independent report, 500 pages this time, really getting into the grisly details of how he was brutally murdered, dismembered by Saudi operatives. And in the opinion of the UN and many other independent experts, Mohammed bin Salman and the top officials of the US royal court are implicated. Meanwhile, on the ground, the executions have continued. The Saudi government has continued to execute a lot of people very abruptly, and is on track to have a record-breaking year of executions domestically as well. So really terrifying trends have continued and accelerated in Saudi Arabia, and unfortunately, with all of the attention on Iran right now, the U.S. government has made clear they actually feel a need to continue to strengthen their relationship with Saudi Arabia rather than making any attempt to call out Saudi Arabia for these human rights abuses. Trump ended up defending Mohammed bin Salman and continuing to assert that he believes Mohammed bin Salman is innocent. I did continue to follow the theme of what happened to Jamal Khashoggi was so shocking, because this was a murder that had taken place far from Saudi Arabia, right? So that was one of the many reasons why it was so alarming and so unexpected, that this was in another sovereign nation, that this Saudi citizen had found himself targeted in the most violent of ways by his own government. And I actually received a tip not long after from a source within the kingdom that pointed me to the story of some women who had fled Saudi Arabia and made it to asylum in Europe, who had found themselves being tracked by officials working for the Saudi government as far as Germany. And that is incredibly alarming, and a trend that I wanted to investigate to see if this was a phenomenon that was really turning global. So I applied for another grant with the Pulitzer Center, actually, and they were able to fund my trip to Europe to meet some of these women. It was quite a nerve-wracking trip, and the women themselves were very terrified. They had escaped abusive homes and a life of really oppressive restrictions, and then found themselves alone in Europe. Many of them were very young, and told me of their stories of being tracked at night, being warned by men sent from the Saudi government that they were being watched. And it was really terrifying. And I only mentioned that to say, like, these women were incredibly brave, and this story was possible because of their courage. So I actually published this story earlier this year, and incidentally, right around that time, we heard the story of Rahaf el-Qanun. I don't know if any of you have heard of her, but she was a woman in a similar case who had run away from home, an abusive father, and been intercepted by the Saudi government in the Philippines, Thailand, I'm sorry, and had decided to broadcast herself live on Twitter, and it caught the attention of a lot of people around the world. And she was actually able to get asylum from Canada, and they repatriated her to Canada, and she now lives in Canada. So it was an interesting, again, intersection of my story coming out at a time that suddenly a lot more people in the world were hearing about this phenomenon, but it's ongoing. And we can talk more about that if you want, but recent reports as recent as a few weeks ago have shown that Many of the former colleagues of Jamal Khashoggi are still being targeted by hackers and government operatives directly operating from the top of the Saudi government. So that's something I'm continuing to follow, and we can speak about. But it really speaks to the fact that the world is actually getting more dangerous for journalists, and it's getting tougher and tougher to report on some of these really pressing issues. And again, that's why I value my colleagues and the Pulitzer Center so much for continuing to pursue stories like that. So where to in Saudi Arabia now? As I mentioned, suppression is ongoing. Loujain and others remain in jail. There's been a lot of calls for justice for Jamal Khashoggi, even from the U.S. government. But Trump has famously used his veto power to sort of overrule some of the Congress's attempts to critique him for not calling out Jamal Khashoggi. The situation for journalists and dissidents in the Middle East is worsening, not just in Saudi Arabia, but throughout the region. Turkey itself is the largest jailer of journalists in the world. Syria, I believe, had the most journalists killed in 1 year last year, and it's a really rough neighborhood for journalists now, and it's a cause that Jamal Khashoggi died trying to address. And that's actually a picture of his final column that was published after his death, but he had filed before he died, and it was a manifesto about the need for free press in the Arab world. It's a really poignant read that I really recommend you take a look at if you're interested, especially in light of his fate. And it's always emotional for me because, as I mentioned, he was someone that I had spoken to several times, and he genuinely suffered. There was a lot of pain in his voice when we spoke of what he sacrificed by leaving the country that he grew up and loved. So this is my last slide, and we can move to the conversation. Just some questions that I would think might arise or be interesting to contemplate for educators and students. There's that trope, don't believe everything you hear. It's complicated now because there's allegations of fake news everywhere and sometimes in absolutely the wrong places, and it gets weaponized in so many ways by so many sides. But the truth is that it can be hard to discern what to believe or how much stock to put in a story and the way it's presented. And so I wonder how we think about the framing of a story, whether we think about how a story is being framed. So this harkens back to when stories in 2017 first started really emerging that were just unadulterated praise for this crown prince that we now think may be a murderer, among other things, and a really dangerous figure with a lot of power in a region that's very volatile. So where were the critiques before Jamal died? Where were the critiques when it was just women civilians going to jail? And how do we think about stories critically when they hit us, rather than looking back later in retrospect and seeing where maybe we should have been more critical? These are just some food for thought, and I think I should probably stop talking because you all are at least as interesting, probably a lot more interesting than I, so let's talk.
Hi, you're obviously very brave to keep going back there. I wanted to, could you explain, I haven't been able to wrap my head around why he would incarcerate the women who led the move to driving when he was agreeing that women should drive. And then I also just wanted to mention that the scary part is also that Saudi Arabia owns large parts of Silicon Valley, like Uber and Lyft and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, it was such a puzzle. I spent weeks talking to people about why would you jail Loujain and her colleagues, who many of them actually spoke to me. Some women who are now in jail, but who were jailed in later waves of arrests, told me, we're a little nervous. This crown prince makes us nervous. But if we're lucky, we'll get to work with him, right? Like, he's finally, like, we're starting to see, we've never seen, like, the royal family actually take an interest in, in Saudi Arabia, it's a top-down sort of government. So some of them said, we'll never get our goals met if we don't work with royal family. So why would he jail them, right? What most people conclude is that he didn't want to allow them any space to speak out. Some of them started to, want to sort of use the momentum. A few women, for example, tweeted right around the time of that announcement, like, this is great, a great first step. We can't wait to see what else our crown prince is going to do, sort of as a way to sort of nudge, but also assert themselves a little bit, like commending the crown prince and then encouraging him to do more. And many people think that Mohammed bin Salman didn't want to be seen as rewarding activists for anything. He didn't want to encourage that whatsoever, and that if they were allowed to have any say in the narrative, it might look like they were working together. And he wanted to make clear that he had the reins, that he was not sharing his power with anyone, and that activism is not encouraged. And it's a well established fact that the Arab Spring didn't really come to Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi government worked very hard to make sure that would happen. And so and ever since they've been very, very wary of anything that smells like activism or grassroots movements. And yeah, if you want to be horrified any further, just research Silicon Valley, Vision Fund, Mohammed bin Salman, things like that.
Hi. How much influence does Wahhabism have over the royal family? And it's, I guess, if it does have a lot of influence, those reforms then would be contradictory, would they not?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Contradictory is one of the operative words, and I'm speaking to Saudis on the ground every day, and contradiction and paradox is where no one can quite square those two. But to answer your question, Wahhabism, for the most part, people would say that the royal family themselves don't really subscribe to that ideology, but in order to really hold the country together, especially at its founding, a deal was struck between these religious factions and the royal family, that this powerful religious sect would endorse the royal family and would sort of issue fatwas in support of them, would give them ideological basis for their power. Keep in mind, when Saudi Arabia was united, it was this vast, I showed you the map at the beginning, this vast, empty expanse of land where there were multiple different tribes that had never seen themselves as part of the same nation, right? So in order for one family to rise up and say that they had legitimacy over all of that domain, they needed some sort of other justification. So the Wahhabi religious leaders sort of decided to partner with them. There's been this alliance ever since. So, I mean, famously, many of the Saudi royal family live very decadent, extravagant lives, right? They have international girlfriends, they spend money, untold millions on expensive cars and lavish parties and alcohol, and many of them have famous drug problems, things like that. But there's this tacit agreement that they're going to keep up appearances and they're going to tout the Wahhabi line, and the Wahhabis will not challenge them and will give them religious support. So there's a lot of influence on some segments of Saudi society, and there are some religious members of the Saudi royal family, but it tends to be more of a strategic alliance than genuine affiliation.
Yeah, I think it's very important that as teachers, we really take seriously this issue of globally what's going on and how it directly impacts us. Mm-hmm. Because so many people sitting here and outside this room will hear these stories and they'll think, oh, thank God I'm living in America. Mm-hmm. Okay? Mm-hmm. But the reality is that, these billions of dollars that are being spent to decimate Yemen and other parts of the world are contributing to deepening crises which are deeply felt here. Mm-hmm. People's health care, their housing, their jobs, the student debt that people don't even think anymore to get a PhD. We're having like a brain drain. Nobody wants to do higher education because for what? I'm not going to get paid anything. A high school teacher will get paid more than it's just this constant, that there is a real disconnect between what's going on globally and various parts of the world and how it will affect us, because Saudi Arabia would not be able to do what it's doing without the U.S. support. That's just the reality. Right. Israel in the region, who is notorious for the constant killing, imprisonment, house arrests, shooting of Israeli, Palestinian journalists, which is never, far from our sight. They're the highest recipients of U.S. aid right now. They're getting paid $10 million a day to maintain one of the most miserable military occupations in the world. Yeah. So that whole region, it's not just, Saudi Arabia and Turkey and all that, but it's all of these other dictators. It's Israel, and it's the U.S. support for that, and not for the oil, because the oil, they're producing more oil than anybody else, but they want to control the oil. They want to make sure that they use it as political leverage so that China doesn't get, and other countries that are getting the oil have to deal with the U.S. So there is all this insidious stuff that's going on, and we're not really doing a good job of helping our students understand how this will directly affect their lives.
Well, I really like how you walked it from the micro to the macro there. I think that that's a really effective way to do it. You talked about student loans, and then suddenly we're talking about geopolitics, right? So that could be a great way in. I think a lot of people understand the fact that there isn't enough money to go around for things that might be really important to them, whether it's student debt. We're in an election cycle now. People are talking about loans, or the shutting down and the scaling back of so many important federal programs. Like if these things are affecting your students, that can be a way into these issues, right? And then the connections to the oil economy dovetails well with environmental issues, which is on the mind of a lot of people too. And propping up this military-industrial complex is really an environmental concern as well. So there's a lot of ways to find your way into these larger subjects, and I really appreciate how you did that. I hope this is happening in a lot of classrooms.
Could you tell a little bit about educational system and how it's changed with that new prince? And do the women have access to higher education?
That's a great question. This is a surprising one for a lot of people. Actually, in Saudi Arabia, more women graduate from college than men. But the breakdown happens. I think it's rising, but it's less than 20% of the workforce is female. So the breakdown is always at the family. And this is true about the driving too. So all women, in theory, could go get a driver's license now. But many of them tell me that that will never be possible for them because their father or their husband or their brother wouldn't let them, right? So there's what's legislated and what's decreed by the royal family, and then there's what actually happens. So the education system in Saudi Arabia has been not good for the most part. The public schools have been notoriously rife with Wahhabism, with religious teachings that are, the curriculum is dominated by religious classes, often to the detriment of things like math and science. There has been an overhaul. Like Saudi Arabia started getting a lot of criticism on this. Well, it had been for years and years, and it finally started to respond after 9/11, pressure from the U.S. saying, hey, there's extremism being taught in your schools. And although that's often overblown, and I also don't want to ever contribute, and this is something I would like to say, it's tough to talk about nefarious regimes in the Middle East without contributing to Islamophobic ideas, so it's always really important to separate Wahhabism and extremism from Islam in general, and it's always, I think there could be a lot more literacy about world religions in general in schools. So I want to, and my family's Muslim, so I don't want to say it's an Islam problem, but there was too much very misogynistic interpretation of Islam in the curriculum. That's been improved, and also Saudi Arabia famously has spent millions and millions to send their students abroad. It has one of the largest abroad programs, government scholarships in the world, but that's now a pressure on the royal family because there are about 70% of the population is under 30, and many of them have studied abroad. So they're coming back to Saudi Arabia wanting to see opportunity, and so it's complicated. Yeah.
Could you just address what would be the best way, in your opinion, as a journalist, to help us teachers teach kids to avoid fake news and get good sources?
Ooh. Please do that. That's a good question, though. How? Well, I think we've heard the question several times today. What is a journalist, right? So, talk about maybe the best advice I could give is talk to them about. I mean, think about what's the process of writing a good story. It's similar to maybe writing a good research paper or conducting a scientific experiment. The question is how do we know what we know? That might be the start for me. Is the journalist, well, first of all, what is the source? Is it the New York Times or is it somebody's blog? There is, that's not to say that you won't find bias even in the most established institutions of journalism, but there is definitely a hierarchy of legitimacy among sources. But then even within that, is the journalist showing in the way they're telling the story what the work was that went into it? Are they citing times and places and dates? Are they linking to things? Can you find other articles that cover the same issue or the same topic, and are they very different from each other, or are they similar? Sourcing is important. If someone's, sometimes it's not possible to use people's real names, but are people citing their sources? Are they showing their work? Think about how maybe you evaluate your students' papers. They need to show their work in some way or another. They need to show how they know what they know. And then you can invite discussion if there are stories that are being covered very differently by different outlets. Having those stories and reading them side by side, you could have a really interesting discussion on point of view. So I think most journalists nowadays would say there is no such thing as objectivity, but you can be fair and you can be dishonest, right? So I try and be fair. I try and show you how I know what I know. If there's a point of view, if my point of view is very strong in the piece, I'll argue from the first person. If it's not my personal view as much as I'm talking to a lot of people who share a certain idea, I will let those ideas show themselves as opinions rather than facts, and they might be opinions based in a lot of empirical reason, but people should know that there's not the right and the wrong, but there's good reporting and fair reporting, and then there's a lot of dishonesty and misrepresentation, and I think a lot of it also comes with how much you read. You start to get a sense. Does that help? I hope. Okay.
Okay. Based on what you said about the education, what is the purpose of the country advertising to other countries to come over there and get a job teaching? I mean, what is that all about?
Advertising to come to Saudi?
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, to teach over there.
Are you seeing a lot of those ads?
Yeah. Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Actually, I think I can speak to that at least partially. That's a great question. Actually, my mom taught in an international school in Saudi Arabia for a while. She's American. And they really place a premium, like many places in the world, on this idea that education is superior in the West. And as Saudi Arabia right now is trying to remake itself as basically another Silicon Valley. They talk about, the Crown Prince has talked a lot about wanting to be a global hub for tech and innovation. He just founded a college for cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, and one of his partners in that college is actually the former chief of the NSA here in the US, who left the NSA and went and founded a private firm. And there's this idea, I think, of in order to be cutting edge, you need to be more like the West. So I think that that's probably where that's coming from, is wanting to draw educators, people from the West, who they look at you and they say that's the best of the best, and that's the superior culture. And it's interesting because you can Saudi Arabia definitely has some hard lines. For example, they were really happy to advertise how they were opening up to Western concerts and movie theaters, but then they were censoring which movies, right, or which performers. And the same would probably go for how much U.S. educational culture will come in, because they always say, but we're going to do it in a Saudi way. So there will be some censorship. But in general, there's many new colleges and schools that are opening up that are private. They're moving way more into private education. It's always been completely public for Saudis. And yeah, it's just a competitive market, and they see market value in Western degrees.
Hi. What you just talked about reminded me of some conference that MLB, is that the Crown Prince?
Oh, MBS.
MBS.
Yeah.
I get all these acronyms mixed up.
No, less fun than MLB.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, he announced a conference. A lot of countries were come. They called it Davos.
Davos in the desert.
Davos in the desert. And then the murder of Khashoggi happened, and a lot of people bowed out of that. Has that affected his progress in trying to develop his new ideas?
It's a really great question. Yeah, that was something a lot of people were watching. So Davos in the desert was going to happen. It was in Riyadh. It was a conference that had been held before that basically he tries to attract the leaders in venture capital in Silicon Valley from the US. And there was a lot of buzz, who's going to show up, who's going to boycott. A few companies, a few big banks and things like that did boycott. What happened more was they just instead of sending their CEO, they sent someone lower down on the totem pole, but they quietly went. And a lot of sadly, a lot of the momentum around chastising the royal family has sort of given way. And a lot of people have decided it's too good to pass up all these investment opportunities. So a few people were putting their money where their mouth was. A lot of people have shut up and just bought back in, unfortunately. So that is, again, something that would be a really interesting debate, maybe in classes, especially for students who might be familiar with companies like Amazon and Apple and Uber. These are all companies that are being invested in by the Saudi government or who are seeking to open branches or extend their services to Saudi Arabia. Uber famously catered to Saudi Arabia's women, they offer a women-only service there and things like that. So they're bending almost to the misogyny in some ways. So it's an interesting ethical question, and there's a lot of the same companies we use are the ones that are investing in Saudi Arabia or being invested in by Saudi money.
Do you have any concerns about your parents or yourself going back there? I hope you're not going to go back there. But do you have fears for your safety there? Or if your parents were to return there, would that be something you'd be concerned about?
Yes.
If you're in the United States, which politicians or which U.S. agencies do you feel have your back? You could go to a call and feel supported by, say, the Chicago Police Department. No, right?
No, I've had some chances to try that out, and it has not been rewarded well. So no, I'm not trying to make myself out to be any more heroic than many other journalists who do similar work, but there's always a calculated risk. And I try and evaluate on each story independently. I won't make a grand statement that I will keep on going back forever, or that I will never go back. But when a story comes to me, or I'm hearing people's stories, or I see something that I want to cover, I evaluate in that moment. So going to Saudi for the last few trips have been an increasingly nerve-wracking choice. But in each case, I sort of weighed what my risks were versus maybe what the risks that people inside Saudi Arabia who are much more vulnerable than I are taking. And, you know, as someone who's privileged to have a U.S. passport and some visibility, the likelihood of something really drastic happening to me is lower than it is for some of the other citizens. But then again, one common trope that we hear now in the region is like, we have no idea what he's going to do next. I mean, who would have thought he would saw someone up in the Turkish embassy, you know? So it's a calculated risk and a consideration. There have been stories that I've decided not to pursue, and I am keeping my options open. But it's, yeah, the U.S. government is not necessarily what I would bank on to get me out of that. You know, much like many of the women who have taken to Twitter when they've been in trouble, like I would hope that maybe an organization or my publisher or things like that might be able to help me out. And yeah, there's just no guarantees.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for all of your questions, and thank you to Sarah. Can we have a round of applause for her?
Thank you.